This is That One Audition with Alyshia Ochse.
This is really exciting. I'm so excited to have you today. And I am going to start this interview in a different place and space because you have such a wealth and resume of working constantly. Then I just want to pick out a few things. So I want to just play a little rapid fire questions and you answer however. I want to know, where's the weirdest place you've had to audition?
I remember the weirdest dressing room that I ever had, which was a fire escape in Manhattan in Hell's Kitchen.
And did they get away with that?
Oh, yeah. This was the middle of the last century.
Uh-huh.
Last century. And I don't think it was Actors Equity. I'm pretty sure it wasn't. So yeah, they got away with it. And it was a cabaret show about 30s Berlin. So that dangerous quality about it felt right, I have to say.
You used it.
Yeah. I did have to tape an audition in my parents' house not that long ago when I was there. And I was trying to frame out things.
Mm-hmm.
This was not a self-tape. This was actually a meeting. Yeah. The framing is different if it's a meeting because it's Zoom. Mm-hmm. It's not, you can't manipulate the frame.
Yep.
And that comes to me because the whole thing was, I didn't have my lights with me. But my parents had a light that I got them for the pandemic, Zoom.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
So I was setting that up and I had really rigged something ridiculous if you look to the other side of it. And I don't think they cast that yet because I think the role now is being reconsidered for maybe another season. This is reminding me that's one that I love to do because if it didn't feel like it was a failure, it just felt
odd.
Odd because
it's just not in your space.
A piece of artwork that I just thought it was not nothing inappropriate, just not what the character would.
Great. So I'm going to pause on some of these fun questions. And I want to ask you this because somebody who has been working as long as you have, there's one thing to master the audition, right? Mm-hmm. Going into the room and mastering the audition, doing a self-tape and mastering an audition. Mm-hmm. There's other ways that we get jobs, which is just having a meeting, a one-on-one meeting with the director. How do you handle those meetings? How do you overly confess your desire to want to do the project? Do you like to show intelligence about the script? Do you even talk about the project? What is your, I don't want to say strategy, but it's a different type of how we get our jobs. And once you get to a certain level or there's enough body of work, sometimes you get to skip that audition process. And then you have a different type of audition. It's like an interview. So how do you handle those interviews?
A long time ago, I learned that the value of these meetings, which I do consider back in the day when people in the room would be the decision makers, it wouldn't just be casting. Mm-hmm. It would be the creators. And whether this was a self-help strategy or just wisdom, because I should make it clear, I didn't start auditioning for film and television until I was 30. So I was already a grown-ass woman that had a sense of my skills and who I was as a person. And I had worked a lot in theater and at high levels of theater. Mm-hmm. So while it didn't mean that I didn't have nerves, it didn't mean that that whole system wasn't new to me. I at least knew who I was. And what I used an audition for was finding out who they are. And by that, the back and forth. Do we have what would be a good chemistry between us? Because these shows, these projects bring out all of that, whether it's good or whether it's not. Yeah. And to be able to use that as a chance to get a read, to feel a vibe, I think is very valuable. Mm-hmm. And that's what I am hoping for in all of these meetings.
I love that you said that. I think especially with new filmmakers, right? So I'm 20 years in. So every once in a while, I'll request a meeting because it is an interview. It's a brand new person that's either written or directed. And I want to know how we're going to work together. And it's interesting when you cross that threshold of, give me the job. I want the job. I'll audition for anything. I'll do anything. I just want to get this job. To then, hey, we're teammates here. How are we going to collaborate together? Can we collaborate together? I know I can do X, Y, and Z. I'm curious how you work with X, Y, and Z. And I think that's an interesting place to get to in your career. And not a lot of people talk about the meetings. So I'm so glad you brought that up.
Right. I say yes to new filmmakers all the time. That became a credo for me when I started working with women in film, because I recognized what I hadn't up until that point, which was there were fewer women leaders during my time in the 80s and 90s in New York, the Broadway musical theater scene. Women were at the center of stories, but a version that men were creating of women. There weren't a lot of female writers on musicals. There weren't a lot of female directors. So when I went to my first Women in Film event, which was a luncheon back in the day, and by that point I was on NYPD Blue. And again, there weren't very many women at the center of power and leadership in that series. And that, for the most part, in the early 90s. And I realized that the character that I was playing was a strong woman, and she was going to get written every week. So there was a chance to see more and more of her. But what would that opportunity really unfold in the hands of people that were not women? So I didn't come at it with a frustration, but a lack of awareness and waking up to it. And what Women in Film taught me when I started serving on the board of our foundation was how many women start films and don't get to finish them. We had a film finishing fund that one of our board members connected us to a woman named Cindy Holland. A lot of you all are listening will know that Cindy eventually became the head of television at Netflix. But at that point, she was in acquisitions, and she began her career as a post-production supervisor. So it was women saying yes to women through so many iterations of people's careers, starting in one field and proving themselves and making opportunities for themselves. And what I know about film and TV is you cannot do it alone. The idea of just shooting on your iPhone, it's fine, but if you're doing it alone, it's still a selfie. We have to say yes to each other. And we must recognize that the power of that yes, if you have already been working, especially for someone who hasn't been, especially for people who don't normally get a door opened, is a really, for me, satisfying part of the privilege of working, the privilege of being at that, the opportunity to say yes. So it's new filmmakers, meaning Ava DuVernay's first feature.
Yes. Yes. Okay.
That was her first feature, and it was a great yes.
And I wanted to ask about a couple of those, if that was an audition or if that was a meeting. Was that a meeting?
An offer. I read the script, and it was a world that I was not familiar with, meaning Black and brown women who were waiting for the loves in their lives, husbands, sons, who were incarcerated. And it's called Middle of Nowhere. Amiansi Cornialdi, David Oyelowo,
yes,
Omari Hardwick, Lorraine Toussaint. Yeah. Edwina Finley. Yeah. It was a world that I hadn't seen. And I was one of the only white people in the film. But it was a beautifully crafted script. And meeting with Ava felt very exciting, not because she was she wasn't at the stature that she was at, but she had written something beautiful. And I could see the intelligence and intensity in the script, and the meeting with her bore that out.
That's what I think is so important and integral to the meetings, is when a visionary comes to a table and they have a clear idea of what they want, it really allows you then to really collaborate your boundaries, where you're going. And I like asking questions of directors and new filmmakers, like, how do you like to conversate? How do you like to work when we might have differences of opinions about the script? How rigid are you with the script? I have some ideas. Are you open to hearing some ideas? Like, how do we communicate with each other? That's really so. And when somebody comes with such a distinguished voice, it makes I think those conversations more comfortable, truly. And
Right.
that's what you
And
attach to.
stage, because I am a different generation than a lot of the filmmakers. There are plenty of people that are my generation that are doing it, but the ones who I was coming up around, my inspirations, the generation ahead of me, they're not all doing this anymore. So I'm working with people who have not worked as many years as I have, but I'm excited by them. And yet I need to understand if our frames of reference are in sync.
Yes.
I remember saying yes to a fresh new filmmaker. It was an interesting story. It was about body dysmorphia, but men's version of that. And I thought the idea was really compelling. And I liked the lead actor. I thought he was so soulful and warm. And I trusted his understanding of this because he lived it. And that authenticity, I always believe, is an X factor that I will seek and I will say yes to, even when other things are not as obvious or assured, because I believe that authenticity with a life experience will provide something really powerful and important. And it didn't matter to me that it was low budget. It didn't matter to me that there wasn't a lot of film that I could see of the DP. So I said yes. And I felt that the role was rich and I would have a chance to lean into something that would be challenging for me. What I didn't know at the time was that the director had an idea that the way you get actors to a performance level is to abuse them. And he even said so at a dinner scene which meant there were a lot of people around. And that's what he started doing. And I felt, as the most experienced person on camera, certainly myself and the one other person, it was up to me to step in, stand up and say, this is not acceptable.
How did you handle that? Did you talk to him in front of everybody, or them in front of everybody? Or how did you handle that? Because
I did stop him in front of everybody in the middle of a take and said, we need to go speak. And we went to another room. But it was very clear that the first time he did it, I was not only shocked and didn't respond. And the truth is, I don't know that he was doing it for his belief. And we hadn't spoken before about what his process would be. And maybe he did not trust that all of the actors would hit whatever level he had expected for the scene. But in my mind, that's never okay, whether it's a new actor or a seasoned actor.
No, it's not okay. And I'm so grateful that you're talking about this on mic, because I think behavior on set, it's changed throughout the decades, what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. And to be able to advocate not only for yourself, but for anybody that is newer to the industry and just so excited to be there. There was many I'm curious, even at the beginning of your career, beginning of my career, where I was yelled off sets, screamed at, abused in different ways, and stuck up for myself, but didn't know if I would ever work again. And a couple of times that I've been on set where the senior person has stepped in, it alleviates that pressure of that desperation of, I'm so excited to be here, but I don't know how to conduct myself or have boundaries. I haven't had enough experience on set to know that's not how all sets work. So thank you for being not only integral to that whole project, but then sharing that here. I think that's what people need to constantly know. How you treat somebody in the streets is exactly how we should treat each other on set. Just because we're on a pressure cooker, we're at camp, right? And we need to have this one collaborative project together. It's a lot of egos coming in, a lot of pressure. So we get to see people at their worst, right? How people conduct themselves under pressure is how I think is indicative of how the project's going to go overall. And I think when people can step in and be educational, because hopefully that person's gone on, hopefully to make other projects and has never conducted himself on that as a leader again. Let's hope. Talking about authenticity, I'm really curious if you if you remember the audition for NYPD Blue or any earlier in the 90s, because there was a formula, there is a formula to procedures. You're so excited. You had been doing theater for so long, and then you started working and getting these great one-off jobs here and there. But then this job, I'm guessing it was a recur to start before it went in. No, it was series regular, even though I want to hear it all.
Okay, I've told this story before, so any of you who are listening that have heard it, maybe you'll jump in because I don't want to be redundant, but it is a great story and it's a very unique story. And I know that it's an inspirational story, so I will tell it again.
It is that one audition. So I feel like that's one we got to know. Yeah.
Yeah. I will start with what is part of the context of that era. This was 92. I'd moved in Labor Day of 91. And I didn't have an agent. I had my SAG card because I'd done a commercial. And I knew no one in the business. And I had moved here really ready to shake off a difficult experience in New York with a difficult leading man who it was a hit Broadway revival, but I was frustrated that we were not protected from the abuse of the star. And yet I also I'd played that character for 2 years at a time, for 2 years, 8 shows a week. And I was ready to do something that would evolve. And during that time, VCRs became ubiquitous and I could watch television again. I hadn't watched television since I left for college in the late 70s. Yeah. But I could watch shows and things like LA Law, Stephen Bunch, and 30 something and China Beach were on. And I was drawn to those women because before I had gone to college, the shows were Dynasty and they were nighttime soaps. And I didn't see myself in any of those people. But the other ones later on, these are working women. It wasn't a fantasy and they were intelligent and equals. And I wanted to spend time with them because I was learning from these women on these shows, these roles. When I came here, there was something called the casting director workshops, and there were a few companies that were doing them. And you paid a fee. I think it was $20 at the time. You would have a chance to be in front of a casting director, often the assistant to whatever casting director was working at a particular company. And you would be given sides at that session, and you'd have some time to look over it. They would pair you up and you would go. So it was basically a cold read. During one of those, I had strategically picked shows that I thought I was interested in and would be right for. And one of them was the casting director for Stephen Bochco's company. And there was a show called Civil Wars on at the time, Mariel Hemingway and Peter Honorati, if you remember. And I had short hair because I had been doing musical theater and wore my hair short just because it was easier for the wigs that I was always wearing. So I looked like a businesswoman. And I went in dressed as a businesswoman. And I did get an opportunity to be called in by Scott Gankinger, who was Junie Lowry Johnson's assistant at the time, for Civil Wars. I booked it. I shot it. It was my first. I think I had the audition that day for Civil Wars and the same day for Cheers. And I remember changing my clothes in my little Nissan 200 SX that I'd driven across the country, changing clothes from Fox to Paramount. And I got both of those jobs. And yeah.
It's a good way to land in a new city.
Right. And I think I got called in for I got to audition for Cheers also, probably because of
the workshop.
Director workshop. Now, I know that people think very differently about them now, and they became a different kind of industry. So I need that caveat there.
Yes.
All of us were doing it if you didn't have an agent, and nobody felt that this was the pay or play dilemma. It wasn't as expensive, and it just was not considered nefarious as maybe it eventually became. That's a harsh word, but
No, but it's true. There were some things that happened later on, but it sounds like at this time, and even when I first started, you went in, it was a great way for them to see you. If you were good, you got put in a folder and they were looking for people. So you were having auditions. You were having auditions from the workshops. It was providing exactly what it had promised.
yes. And they called me in after that Civil War's job for prior to, let me back up a little bit. In the intervening 3 months, 6 months, it's hard to tell because it was California. Normally I know what the seasons are, but I don't.
Right, totally.
I was getting the breakdowns. Anybody who is my generation would know that there was an illicit underground service to get the breakdowns, and they would come through a fax machine that you'd have in your home, and you'd somehow, somebody in casting director offices or agents' offices, I don't know who they were, you get on a list and your fax number would receive the breakdowns. And I remember it coming through the machine and seeing it was Stephen Bochco Productions, and it was a new show. I don't know if it was titled yet, but at the top, written in Sharpie, was nudity required. And I saw it, and it went. I just let it go right in the pages, go right in the trash can. Because for me, nudity meant Baywatch body, that kind of female. And I was a Broadway dancer. I knew my body. I knew what I could play, but I'm not that. That was not how I saw myself. Mm-hmm. So I assumed that's what that meant. And I think that's important because
the assumption of what they want. Mm-hmm.
The assumption of what they want and how nudity would be used, because it goes back to authenticity. That was for the series regulars. There it went. Then I get an opportunity, because at that point, maybe with Civil Wars, the casting office may have said, we need to put you in touch with an agent to negotiate this, which is how I got my first agent here in LA. So the opportunity to audition for a day player on the same show for the pilot came along. And they say, ignore the sides. It was written for a man. But I believe that someone in the Bochco camp recognized there weren't enough women in that world. There weren't enough women populated in that world. And this again was happening as things were shifting in the industry. And it was written for a man in the script because Sipowicz, one of the leads in the shows, is having a conflict with this assistant district attorney, only called in the script ADA. And he grabs his crotch at the guy and says, yeah, well, ipsa this, you little bastard. It's Latin for the thing speaks for itself. And we know it was a man, but they wanted to see women. I went in and I got the role, and it was a day player. And we shot at the Fox lot on a sound stage, and it was a courtroom sequence. And the rest of it was to unfold in a hallway. The famous moment that was so famous, it ended up on the cover of the New York Times when NYPD Blue premiered.
No way.
31 years ago. And there's a picture of myself, Dennis, and David Caruso. Because they liked that sequence so much, they decided to shoot this on location in New York at 100 Center Street, which is the actual authentic courthouse in downtown Manhattan.
Yes.
So that's another reason authenticity mattered. We did shoot it in the hallways and through a revolving door and spilling out onto the street. And it just added a level of excitement to it. And what I didn't realize at the time was they had decided to make that whole sequence, opening in a courtroom and spilling out onto the streets, and Sipowicz going wild, and David Caruso, the observer of this whole courtroom and watching Sipowicz shoot himself in the foot, and this DA, this woman who was blowing a hole in his case and embarrassing him, became the teaser for the pilot episode.
Oh, that's a gift.
That's a gift. And they flew us to New York. And so I spent more time hanging out with the team, Greg Hoblet, the director, David Milch, Greg Hoblet also happened to see me in Kennedy Airport, flying back from a trip with some friends from Italy. And I was not with, my hair was short, but I wasn't in a business suit. I wasn't in my wardrobe. I was in shorts and a tank top. And they got the idea to make this a love interest that they had never even imagined.
All from all of that.
Yeah. Combatants.
Juxtaposition.
To a great love story. And the nudity that I never thought that I would be part of, I became part of in a scene. While it is notable for Dennis Franz's backside, it's also notable because we were not the sexy couple. They gave us sexuality. We were earnest, real people, working class, but more than that, just middle-aged people. And they gave us a sexuality. And they used my femininity in a way that was playful and encouraging and warm and grounded. And that led to
an award-winning a whole entire career. So I'll be remiss if I don't dig into a couple of these things if you're willing to do it, because like you said, nudity goes in the trash. So now you have a basis of
but through men's eyes.
Yes, exactly. So as an actress, it's different for a man. But when we get these nudity writers, I'm curious how you negotiate your nudity and what feels good for you and what is even, I've talked about it before on the podcast, but I would love to know from your experience, especially because it's changed over time too, what your restrictions and limitations are. So other actresses that are listening to this know what's quote unquote, I want to say normal. It's different to every project and it's different to every person. But if you're willing to be open about that and share like what was in your nudity writer and then how did that work from the writer to what happened on set? It sounds like it was all very respectful. Yeah.
This was happening. The sequence in NYPD Blue was before we had nudity writers that were embedded within them was no sexual harassment. Clauses. And frankly, the experience on NYPD Blue and what women were going through on that show with certain crew members led to the studios recognizing they needed to protect themselves because the behavior was not always respectful.
Yeah, I think that's why the evolution of the nudity writer.
We've come a long way. We've come a long way. Those monitors were fair game. Anybody could be around them.
Thank you.
Changed. And I respect our union. I want to clarify. People think oftentimes that I'm on the board of the SAG-AFTRA union. I'm on the board of our foundation, which is a separate arm. I'm never in the negotiations for contracts. That's not what we do. We do our emergency assistance programs and all the training and our wonderful Storyline Online. I'm really proud of that work, but I take no credit for negotiations. And I want to give props to the team that has made a difference.
Yes.
I'm sure that we are protected. We did not have intimacy coordinators. That was not a thing. We had I believe that body makeup was always offered and included. And I say that because those of you who have done it may have had this experience that I did, that funny enough, this digresses a little bit, but I think it's worth mentioning. The body makeup process is that first step toward intimacy. And because somebody's doing your body makeup and you may be your intimate areas of your body may be covered up, but that makeup may also very well be that may be exposed to be covered up. So there was a union for body makeup artists and that's gone away. So I think first and foremost, if you are considering that, find out, make sure that you know the people that are putting the body makeup on you, because that is one of the most intimate things that will be part of the process.
That is, I'm so glad you noted that. I would have even forgotten about that in the step. Like normally the nudity writer, it's okay, you can see the left butt cheek, but not the right. I'm comfortable with the side boob, but nothing this.
Yes.
You're right. Body makeup. Who's putting on the body makeup? Monitors. It should be a closed set to your comfort. And it's not just the set, who's around the monitor. So they can close it down. There might only be 3 people in the room, but then you got 60 people at the monitor taking video of the monitor. So like the protections.
Yeah. And it's not right. And it's not just that, it's that they could be back there joking around and commenting.
Exactly.
And they were.
Ugh.
The TV and film landscape, it's constantly changing, but traditional actor training has largely remained the same.
It's focused on a theater model whose main goal is to help you stretch the expression of your instrument. That's why you can have years of training,
From scene study classes to audition classes.
to even an MFA, and still not be able to book a 2-line co-star.
That's why we created The Bridge for Actors.
A collection of tech, craft, and business online courses to teach you the skills that you need to go from a student of acting
To a working actor.
So I will jump a little bit, but during that era, the 90s, the way that NYPD Blue, because it was the first network show to do that. And if you're watching this and you haven't seen that show, I should have prefaced it. The reason that this was such a big deal, nudity was never on nighttime television until our show. It was a 10 p.m. scheduled show, and there were a lot of protests. Reverend Wildman created this whole religious coalition, which, by the way, was part of the religious right, and which has only gained power and influence over these past 30 years. And I will leave it at that. But it did change the culture. It changed the conversation. And there were companies that boycotted ABC, which was the network, but it also became the most watched show on television because people were interested. And it lined the coffers of many local news networks because people would stay tuned for the end of the show and then watch the local news cast right after that fed into nighttime news. It was a cultural phenomenon for a lot of reasons. And there were fights that Stephen Bochco and and David Milch, that team would have with what were called standards and practices. They were the system within all the networks that would control what was acceptable. And they finally came to an agreement that standards and practices and the Bochco team settled on, and the network, which also included the way advertisers were looking at this, which was the show was not allowed to show anything pink or furry.
That's great.
I think pretty self-explanatory.
Absolutely. It's great. But again, you're right. You're a part of a groundbreaking show at a time where television is changing. Also, during that time, your guys' ratings, it's so different now too, right? Everybody, millions upon millions of people are watching this show. So I'm curious, going to this type of exposure, going to being in people's living rooms daily. After this show ends, and I'm sure it wasn't right away, how does it feel to shift back to the audition game? Because everybody's, oh, we know Sharon. She plays Sylvia, right? You're typecast, which is a beautiful thing. Think about everybody on Friends, right? Some of them, it took them a long time to work because everybody knew who they were. And they wanted to say, no, they're that person. How did you decide what to do next? So that's one question. And then how did you approach auditions? Were you trying to get away from that part? And then were you able to get those auditions that were so different from that?
I had such an interesting path. Also during that time, our hiatuses, because we shot 22 episodes, our hiatuses were 3 months. And I was one of those women that were offered nice chances to play number 1 on the call sheet, to do a movie for the networks and in the summers, and go on location and make good bank. real good bank. That was the television film era. And I did some that I'm so proud of. And I got to work with Giancarlo Esposito, and I did a two-hander that I produced called Five Desperate Hours, a true story, authentic. The people that it happened to let myself and our producer, Thomas Carter, and Giancarlo tell this story rather than HBO. I'm really proud of those opportunities because they were way far away from the character I was playing, Sylvia Costas on NYPD Blue. And also, I was offered a guest star on a sitcom called Caroline in the City. And that was also with Jimmy Burrows directing, who I had done Cheers with, but it was a very different role than the Cheers role. I was very internal and it was a sex therapy group, but I was an unlikely sex addict and very small. This was a woman who was a headhunter trying to quit smoking, and she was at the end of her rope and was interviewing Malcolm Getz, who was one of the lead characters on that half-hour show. And she's seducing him while she's tearing her hair out, metaphorically and a little literally. So it was really physical. And Jimmy Burrows knew I was a dancer. And in rehearsal, I let myself go. My instincts for that kind of comedy and physicality were really vibrating at a huge level. And that night of the taping, there were a lot of execs there, like there always were back then. And the audience went nuts with this role, this character, and what we were doing with it. And I was dressed, unlike Sylvia, Sylvia's suits were very boxy. She was representing the way women in the legal field in the New York City system dress, which was not to draw attention to their sexuality, very much a male uniform. This was really curved, cut, short skirt. And that part of my body, that use of my body was focused on, let's put it that way. A lot of leg. So the audience went nuts, and I got a lot of focus from that. The agents started talking. I remember Stephen Bochco and I were flying to Vegas on the Bochco private jet to do the big, what was called NATPE. It was the cable industries conference to sell the show. And I had just shot the night before. And I said, it was really fun. It went really well. And they were already talking about offering me a show from that night. And he said, come and talk to me. He was so great. He was excited for me because he also knew that Sylvia once she was having a baby, there was going to be less that we were going to do with her. It was just the way it went. And it turned out that NBC offered me my own show, Fired Up, Leah Remini, Mark Feuerstein, Jonathan Banks. I was playing a Frasier type character, a fish out of water, a very privileged character who had fallen on hard times, and ostentatious, but a lot of fun. I'm so proud of that show. We were part of the women's comedy night that NBC was doing. And it's because Stephen Bochco said yes. So I was doing two shows at the same time on two different networks.
That's unheard of. That's my next question was going to be, how were you allowed to do both? And that all happened from one night. Sharon, that's incredible.
Yeah.
Talk about striking gold and I always talk about development and relevant on this podcast. Development is when you're in a learning phase. That's all I think that is. And then relevant is when you've mastered something. And it's fun to hear where the industry met your mastery. Like you had been hitting the streets hard and Broadway, off Broadway. It wasn't like you just started at 30. So I want people to understand that like you went to school for this, you were doing this, but also at a time when they were telling you, even when I started, they're like, once you hit 30, you're done. You hit 30 and your career exploded. And I need people to hear, like, we've changed the language and we've changed what we see on television. And so that leads me to this next question. And I'm not quite sure how to ask this because I got asked this the other day from an actress. And I thought it was a really great question on how do you transition when you're going from being relevant and you've mastered something. And this young actor was just transitioning from her 20s into her 30s, but she was still playing high school. So she's transitioning. When you transition from different phases in your career or in your life, my work before being a mother is much different than my work once I became a mother. I transitioned. Even the work from my 20s to my 30s to my 40s, wildly different. But it takes the industry some time to catch up with, oh, you've transitioned to a new phase of your life. How have you seen that, or how have you adjusted with that through different periods of your life and growth just as a human? Because you've gotten to audition for decades. I've gotten to audition for decades. I'm just starting to get a grasp on that, right? Of that transitional space. I'm like, oh, I'm going out for these roles now. Oh, okay. Or, hey, I want to go out for those roles now. Like, how did you handle that? Or was the industry open to you to transition very easily from different parts of your life?
I think that from NYPD Blue to Fired Up confused people.
Yeah.
I was playing somebody so beloved and wise. I called her Saint Sylvia. She was so grounded and so clear and just made all the right moves, all the right choices. She was inherently appealing, but matronizing for me. And I wasn't that. I was this. So I was playing somebody very different from me with Sylvia. And I was also playing somebody very different from me in Fired Up, because I'm a homegirl from North Carolina. I'm a middle-class gal. I don't love to shop. I am not someone who's constantly speaking down to my staff, but I knew how to do it. There was something about that I understood the rhythm, and playing a character like Gwen Leonard, not Gwen Leonard. She changed it to Leonard. So that gives you a clue. And I loved poking fun. I loved playing somebody who was just so ridiculous. It was a blast, but it confused the industry. They didn't quite know what to do. And that pain in the ass has ended up translating for me in a good way, I think, because people, when they wanted to see the pain in the ass mother-in-laws, when I aged into that, I had street cred. You could see that I could do it. And those roles, which I played maybe first on maybe One Tree Hill, was maybe an early one of those kind of characters. And then later Dynasty, I didn't have to audition for. The industry knowledge that I'd done, it spoke for itself. And one of the things that I did have to be able to bring into people's minds was that, and I had done a play every year. I do a play every year because I need to be able to choose what muscle I want to work next so that it doesn't atrophy. And that muscle that needs to be, I think at that time, it exercised and revealed was vulnerability. So when I auditioned for Joe Pickett, which is one of the most wonderful experiences that I've ever had, as not just a character that I really enjoyed and loved, and I was really cut out for, but the team that we did it with and the location where we did it. And we did 2 seasons and we're primed for the 3rd. It was so on everybody's lips. We were going, and that the constriction and the fact that it was Paramount Plus is what meant that the network didn't go for it, because they were the ones that were struggling the most. And it had all the things going for it: a great IP, a best-selling novel series, Michael Dorman as our lead, the Dowdle brothers, who I would recommend everybody work with. They did Waco and they did our show. And I submitted a tape for it. This was pandemic days. So it didn't feel weird to go on tape for this. And then we had a Zoom call, which was so terrific because I spent time watching their interviews together, but they were brothers. And I thought, how's this going to work? I was concerned.
How you're going to take direction. Who do you pay attention to? How,
And who are they together? And what is that like when we're on location, away in a pandemic, when so many things rely on your personal, good word for it, your resilience. I've seen it in both ways because I worked a lot through the pandemic. But that role was that ostentatious woman. That role allowed me the physicality. It allowed me the sexuality. It allowed me a woman of a certain age who all of us at this point in time realize we are vulnerable. We will get more vulnerable. Is our vulnerability a power, or is it a dilemma, a challenge, a weakness?
I would love to hear you elaborate on that. I don't know what audition scenes you had for Joe Pickett. I'm curious. I was just teaching and we were just discussing this specifically for women, because in scripts, you'll see she breaks down uncontrollably or sheds a tear out of the left side of her eye. They never do this for actors. You only see it for actresses. But we were just talking about the challenge of playing a woman that's weak, or their vulnerability, their tears are literally seen as a weakness, versus choosing to have power in that moment. And I like to say that when we're reading a script, sometimes written by a man and through the male gaze, it's for the reader sometimes when they say uncontrollably breaks down here. And it's for us to find what fuels that vulnerability. And it might come out as anger, or it might come out as silence, or brooding silence. So I'm so curious how you handled vulnerability and what audition scenes you might have had, especially because you were taping at home.
Yeah, it's her first scene, her introduction scene, which is great. Now, let me preface this. Missy, the character, is the pain in the ass mother-in-law. She's a big part of the books. And I chose not to read the books because while I saw what the script was saying, so I didn't want to assume anything and put something on it that maybe wasn't helpful. And that's just how I did it, in case anybody wondered, because I don't look like she's described, but I didn't know that until later. And I'm really glad that I didn't. She's drunk, and you know that she's drunk. They say it. And the script read, Mary Beth, played by the incredible Juliana Guile. Watch both seasons of this show to see a woman create a character, talk about vulnerability and strengthen that. She is astounding in this role. They're pulling up and they hear opera music play from the house at a huge volume. That told me a lot right there. This is somebody who's wallowing. And I allowed that wallow to show with a grandiosity, an alcohol-stoked grandiosity. And I did something instinctually, which was I chose to dress in a peignoir set, a negligee that made sense for her. It was luxe. It had a sheen. So you can tell this was quality, because it's a woman who is all about the money. And she's found out that the government came and foreclosed, seized her home and carted her lover, as she calls it, her lover, away to prison. So she's stranded, and they're going to take everything she has. And she's called her daughter and her son-in-law, who is Joe Pickett, who is Michael Dorman. Incredible. If you don't know Michael Dorman, he was the lead in Patriot on Amazon. He's currently on a show called Territory, an Australian show. He's Kiwi. And For All Mankind, he played Gordy, who drove the great Corvette. So those are people of the earth, and she's the contrast. So she's there to change the tone, to change the temperature in the script. And I knew this. And what I did that I think really helped was I rather than just be here and big and that sadness, that volume, that diva, which she was, I had a pillow that I was clutching. And that childlike sense brought me to the fear that she really had.
Yes. Look at that magic. Look at that magic too, when you bring it into your body and make choices. I ask this at the end of every interview. I want you to come back. There's so much we could dive into. Sharon, you have to come back. But like you just did for us in a breakdown of this, in any audition, whether it's theater or whether it's for television and film, when you get something, you read it, obviously. I know you read it. But what are some of the tangible tools that you do to start doing your script analysis that start making you be like, okay, I know how to do this? Because you could probably do this in your sleep. And I think sometimes what actors, I'll put myself in this camp, I'll read something. I'm like, oh, I know who this is. And whenever I do that, I'm like, oh, okay, let me slow down. Let me scrape through this a little bit more meticulously so I don't make assumptions and I don't miss things, because sometimes we're moving fast. And when you've been auditioning as long as you have and you've been doing script analysis forever, I'm curious, what are the things that kind of always rise to the surface for you to do first to start, digging in?
I mentioned it before. I knew that this character, I can tell if the character, if the scene is there to change the temperature
That
within
part.
the story.
Mm-hmm.
You all know this, if script analysis, any film in any scene in film and television is meant to shift something. It shifts the plot, or it shifts what we know about the character. I do a lot of theater, and that isn't always the case, because that's just putting more meat on the bones. I've been doing this solo play about Catherine Graham that I'm continuing to do, and I learn more and more about that. That type of world is it, because it's so much more language oriented, it's texture. But film and television is often more pared down, and it is about changing the audience's gear and what they're seeing, where the turn is on the road. So knowing what the story is coming from, and they may move the scene, but they still have that script in their head. So it's a nod that they'll pick up even subliminally. I do believe in the opposites. If you are in a seduction scene, like the NYPD Blue story, if you're in a seduction scene, maybe you start out with a little colder. You're not right on, and then there's something hidden that gets to be revealed. And I read the dialogue. I read the scene for myself on my voice record on my phone, a first take, a first pass. After I've read the script, right? A first take, a first pass on the way my body is going to say it instinctively. I'm reading, I may fuck up the word. It doesn't matter. What I want is my blind take, my first take. And then I start to walk. I learn kinetically. So I start to walk, and I can tell when I'm listening to this again, whether my first take felt real, the places that it felt real, the places that it felt not real. And I know myself enough now. So I'm adding those, I'm combining initial perspective, a movement-based activity that keeps me off the page, and listening to it, listening, because that's how it will be received.
That's
watching your tape is they're gonna hear you first. Oftentimes we're so busy on the words because we're learning it visually, that I think learning it orally, try it, just see what it does for you, because you can hear when it's false.
yes.
Right?
Yes. There's some casting directors, some very well-known casting directors, when we used to go into the room, Kim Coleman, there's another one where they actually look down. They're not watching you because they're listening to you. I'll never forget when Kim stood in the corner of one of my auditions and she goes, okay. And then walked out of the room, and I was like, I don't know what that means. Yes, no. And she's been lovely and a fan, but she was listening. She didn't have to see me. So I love that note, Sharon. That's actually, we need to do that more. You're right. It's exactly. And what brings us back into the room, especially when casting directors are now watching us, right? I don't get to see Kim stand in the corner. She has to watch my tape, but I bet you she's eating. I bet you she's like doing something else, right? And a lot of times when casting directors are watching 100 tapes now, let's hope, they get a phone call. Their dog starts barking. They go somewhere else. What's going to bring them back? You say something. They're like, wait, what? They just did something different. What were they saying? That's different than what I've been hearing. That's a beautiful tip. That's so great.
But also learn, are you following through with the thought to the end of the line, which is what theater teaches you? But oftentimes people that are steeped in film and television, they'll end up talking, and then what you find is that there's just dies by the time the line ends. It's a habit. So
it's one of my pet peeves where actors break up a thought before they end. And I'm like, what are you doing? What are you doing right now? Finish the line, go through the line. Nobody talks like that, but it's interesting how we'll get stuck in a memorization. So I think it's so great to have different ways. And I love hearing from other actors different ways in to start breaking it down and tangible things. You can call it a technique. It doesn't matter. Every audition is different. You can grab out different tools, but for the most part, how we really sit down and give ourselves the time to focus really is what bears the fruit. And sometimes I think people don't know how to harvest, or the seed is planted, but they don't know how to harvest that. So thank you. You have a wealth of information. You have a resume that exudes most resumes. You've withstood so many transitions in this industry. And I love that you continue to do theater every single year. If nothing else, if nobody else takes anything else from this, I was going to even ask you a question. What do you do when you get on a show and you start to get a little bored? You go and you stroke that place with theater, or you go and you make your own content. You are like still a yearning learner, which I think makes your curiosity makes you such a dynamic force to watch, whether it's on stage, on television, or in film. Thank you for continuing your curiosity and paving the way for so many of us that are on your tails, like just being like, what are you doing next? How are you doing this? Because there's so many of us that just adore. Please come back so we can pick out some more. And thank you for letting me get in there so that you can mentor so many of us that listen. I really am so grateful.
Thank you for doing this. I've learned from watching your podcast. You are so good at examining, at encouraging, at evolving yourself and helping all of the rest of the people that are creative artists evolve themselves. There's no set formula, and you're making that clear with this offering. So thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, love. That made me emotional. Where can everybody find you and all of the great things that you're doing right now? Because I know are you going on stage starting in January? Yep.
I'm actually doing a play December in New York, December just the Christmas week. It's a rotating cast called Pen Pals. It's very sweet. It's two women who've been pen pals for 60 years. So we age from age 14 to in our 70s, and it'll be off Broadway. They open tonight, which we're recording this in early December. I'm coming in with Catherine Curtin, who from Stranger Things and Orange is the New Black. It's a two-hander, and we'll be doing it December 26th through the 29th. So if this is posted by then and you can come see us in New York, do it. I'm making my solo play called The Shot about Katharine Graham, the famed publisher of the Washington Post during the Pentagon and Watergate eras. And it's really about her life, the struggles of her personal life, which led her to resilience that made her one of the most important leaders in the world.
Which theater are you doing that?
That will be at the Playmakers Rep in January the 7th through the 12th. That's my alma mater at UNC Chapel Hill. And we are looking at dates here hopefully in LA. We've won awards in New York before, and we played the Berkshires. We've been doing this. I say it's an all-female team, the writer and director and I. So it's very satisfying to be part of. And you can find information about it on my IG. That's where I tend to be most. My Facebook algorithm, I don't know how it got all screwed up. So I'm just not there nearly as much as I am in Instagram. And that's Sharon E. Lawrence.
Sharon E. Lawrence. I adore you. Thank you so much. This was lovely.